First, thank you for joining. My name is Amy Vandenbroucke. I'm the Executive Director of National POLST, and I manage the National Form Project. In September, the National POLST Form was released along with patient guides supporting the POLST process and form, and this project represents a major step towards national consensus and is the result of almost 2 years of collaboration through interviews, consensus building, feedback, compromise, and iterative versions of the form and guides. My hope is that this provides an appreciation for the project and the decisions that we made. I do want to thank the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation for their support of this grant. I'll start with a brief overview of the project documents, the purpose, and the process, but most of this webinar will be about implementation and form-specific information. Please feel free to ask questions whenever using the chat box. Some of this is probably well known, but POLST is a national movement. It is implemented at the state level. Since patients travel in and out of states, our goal is to make sure that all the states are using POLST in a way that's easy for patients. Participation in national POLST is voluntary. We encourage all states to participate, meaning that they are helping create, helping with the national government, creating guidelines, policies, etc. And our hope is that by getting buy-in for the creation of all these documents, states will adopt them and support not only the national movement, but the consistency needed to make it successful. And we use carrots. We can't force anyone to do anything. No part of our program is mandatory. So we're trying to just find ways to make things easier for everybody to use POLST in a consistent and appropriate way. This project is all about compromise. We have 3 different audiences that we were focused on that are very diverse. We were looking at how is this easier for emergency personnel and first responders, for patients, and for providers. Plus, we have states that have been doing this work for a number of years, some up to 20 years. And so we felt it was really important to make sure that they were involved in the process, to make sure that they had what they wanted in it. And then, of course, we had interested parties that were reaching out saying, we'd love to see this, or can you remove that? So a lot of the information was just trying to make sure that we were providing the right information for all these parties to the extent that we could. And I think the ultimate question, at least for our state leaders and coalitions who are ultimately deciding on whether or not they want to use the form, is you may not love it, but can you live with it to achieve our national and collective goal? This is really just a first step, and hopefully a good one where we can continue building this consistency and make good things happen, great things happen. So starting with what you can find online, if you go to polst.org/form, this is what the website looks like. And this is where you can find all of the documents I'm about to share, along with a video from Indiana. So the first thing we have on there is the National POLST Form. You can download it. It does say sample because right now it can't be used in any state. We just want to be able to provide so people know what it actually looks like. The second is the form guide. And this is a comprehensive look at the purpose of the project, the form elements, excluded form elements, research opportunities, and then a list of the participants and key activities. This guide was created to provide transparency for the project. We wanted to share what was learned in the process and provide rationale for why decisions were made relative to the form. Hopefully, it facilitates a better understanding of the form, why we undertook this project, the challenges in creating a POLST form, and identify opportunities for improvement. Additionally, for states where there's legislative or regulatory barriers to adopting the national form, we're hoping that the rationale helps those states align their forms to the extent possible to what the national form looks like, or that this could be used as support for them to make the necessary legislative or regulatory changes. We all know that the POLST form should be reviewed periodically. Several states had review charts on the back side of their forms, and we didn't want to lose that, although many states said that they didn't use it. They didn't know that it was how it was being used necessarily. Excuse me. but they felt like it was important to help remind people that this needed to be periodically reviewed. I didn't want to lose that value, but what I did was I took all of the charts that existed on the different state forms and just put it into a single document with reminders that it should be reviewed, and then just letting facilities figure out what might be the best thing that works for them. One state in particular said that their nursing homes use it all the time on almost a weekly basis to check. So the idea is that you'd be able to take this and make a single document where it just has all these checklists. It's just what format works best for your facility. And then 2 patient guides were created. I want to thank Cambia Health Foundation for putting together a consumer group. It was a group of 6 different women who were completely unfamiliar with POLST, and they met with me and we reviewed different iterations of this document. The first one is about preparing for the conversation. So it explains what POLST is, how it fits into advanced care planning, and then on the back side, it has a short checklist that patients or families can use to figure out how to prepare for the conversation. And then the second guide is interpreting the POLST form. Patients are obviously one of the audiences we were looking at, but the form itself is a medical order. And one of the challenges that we have is that forms are being given to patients to complete, which is not how it should be done. So our intent was to keep POLST at a high health literacy level or make it even higher to really have people stop and think, should they be doing this? So the form itself is not intended for patients, but we want obviously the part of the project, or the process. So we created this document for patients to take. Obviously, they should know what their form says because they had the conversation, but this can hopefully serve as a good way to remind patients about what it said and help them share with their family members or friends what the form says and what it actually means in terms of treatments. For the next few slides, I will provide the link and then the pages of the form guide, so if you want to look at it later on, you have that as a reference source. The purpose is to make things easier. Our national vision is that all states have adopted the POLST program, resulting in consistency of process, improved patient care, and greater patient control and direction over medical treatment. What we want is for people who use POLST to be able to travel from one state to another and have that form be honored and recognized, and we want patients to have confidence that will happen. Right now, we currently have 50 different versions of the form in at least 5 different colors. We have 16 different names, and the purpose of this project was really just to simplify and help us accomplish our mission. Having one form makes things so much easier, including our ability to honor patient treatment wishes, which is the purpose of POLST. Having one form is consistent across all states, improves portability, it eliminates reciprocity issues, and it can mitigate variation. So again, even if states don't adopt the national form, can they get their forms similar enough? With reciprocity, many people think that even just passing a statute might solve the problem, and it doesn't for a couple of reasons. First, states like Maine and Oregon, they've successfully implemented POLST without any legislation. So asking them to create legislation for reciprocity is just opening up a can of worms. Second, language about reciprocity is different in different statutes. The most common phrase requires that out-of-state POLST forms be, quote, substantially similar to the state that they're in. So, for example, you have Maryland, and they have a very generous statute that allows all out-of-state POLST forms to be recognized. And that means that all patients can go to Maryland and have their form honored. However, Maryland's POLST form, called a MOLST, is not substantially similar to any other state's form. And therefore, a Maryland resident, can't have their form honored outside of Maryland. And it's great that Maryland has a receptive statute, but unless other statutes change, it's just not possible. Additionally, when you have reciprocity, when you have more than one form, you have patients needing to track 2 or more forms, you have families needing to help patients track 2 or more forms, and you have healthcare professionals who need to be familiar with all 50 different versions. They need to know which ones they can honor and which ones they can't according to their state law. And in addition to being able to figure out and honor it, possibly during an emergency, they also need to figure out how to advise their traveling patients. And in fact, we just had a situation where someone contacted the national office saying that their patient was traveling across 4 states and they wanted a POLST form, and they wanted to know what one should they use. So I had to reach out to 4 different states to respond. And ultimately, the responses and the timing of all of this, it ended up being easier for the patient to just have a DNR and not a POLST. And I think that's a step backwards for us. When a POLST doesn't work for a patient, people aren't going to use it. And I've heard similar situations like this for the Make-A-Wish Foundation. And I think this should be a real concern for anyone that wants to see POLST be successful, the challenge that we've made in having 50 different versions. Other reasons for this is we wanted to make it easier to educate. I've heard a lot where healthcare professionals are trained in one state, but they know POLST as a MOLST. And when they go to another state that maybe uses a different term like POST, or MOLST or POLST, whatever is different, they don't immediately connect that that's actually the same thing. And that's just an unnecessary challenge. It can create confusion for patients as well. It's really hard to understand when you have to start off making sure they understand that their acronym is the same as POLST if they don't already use it. And again, these are just things that I don't think we need to spend our time educating on when we can be focusing on the actual substantive piece of POLST. And then finally, it's easier to improve. Right now, education, or research and quality assurance is really within the state because the form is different from state to state. And if we have more similarities, what we can do we can increase what we do nationally by using the same form, being able to compare apples to apples, which can help with the improvement of POLST overall. So moving on to the process, that was the rationale, the process. This was, again, a 2-year process, and it was collaborative. So the list of participants is on pages 31 to 36 in the form guide. And then the project timeline, I just kind of gave the overview, is on 37 and 38. But I wanted to reiterate a couple of key steps. There was an invitation to all states to participate, regardless of whether or not they're actively involved with national POLST. I personally invited everyone. 2, I did an in-depth review of all the forms and all the elements. I have a very, very detailed Excel document that goes through every single little detail of these. So I did look at every single form, and I looked at the historical forms if we had that. Part of the invitation was asking each state to spend at least an hour talking to me, which most states did. And we talked about their current form, the history of form changes, if any existed, and we really talked about what would the leaders change if they could, and what were the areas of contention that they had. States have so much history from developing and updating their forms that this was probably one of the most critical pieces of this project, is interviewing and pulling all that information together. Research, looking at articles or other documents related to POLST forms, positive and negative. Multiple iterations were sent out to a small group of consultants for feedback, and then I pulled information from that into at least 5 different versions were sent to states for feedback, along with questions that I specifically wanted answers to, as well as an open invitation to comment on anything else the states felt was important. I still find it kind of ironic that the 3rd version of the form sent to states was the one where we actually hired a form consultant and worked with her, and that form was universally hated, which in and of itself is a good thing that people felt so strongly. It just kind of was entertaining that the consultant wasn't as helpful as we hoped. There was a survey that was sent to states, and then there was lots of discussion at the May Plenary Assembly meeting, which is a convening of all of the leaders that are actively involved in national POLST governance. So we want to encourage all states to either adopt the form outright or to use a version as close as possible to the document. And the ways that we're encouraging that is, 1, all the national resources and images that we will be using from here on out are using the national form. So if people want to take and adopt any education we come up with in the future, it has the national form on it. We're working on translations of the form at our cost. So right now we're working on translating it into Chinese. Education, again, using the document image, but we're also working on continuing medical education, continuing nursing education, and we're working with partners like Respecting Choices and Ariadne Labs to develop education or make sure that the national POLST elements are included in their education going forward. And then we're working with National Partner on promoting the form and having statements of support to make things a little bit more formal. We do have current leaders of adoption. Arizona has formally adopted. They have their form, and they will start using it imminently. My understanding is that Massachusetts has adopted it, but they're actually waiting for the Department of Health for official approval. Alaska wasn't able to adopt the form because of the signature line, but what they did was they asked me for the Word version, and they're making a couple of tweaks. So it won't be called the National POLST form, it'll still be Alaska, but it will be nearly identical to the national one, which is still something that we're looking for. And then the other states that are considering it that I'm aware of right now are Colorado, Idaho, Iowa, Maine, Nebraska, and Utah. I always feel like I'm leaving a state off that list, so I apologize if your state is considering it and it's not on this list, please let me know. I also recognize that there are some, for some states, there are legislative or regulatory barriers. I don't have any illusions that this national form is something that all states will adopt within the next 5 years or 10 years, but I do expect that all states will consider using this one way or another and think about what, is this level of compromise acceptable in the interest of the larger picture of helping patients and healthcare professionals. I never forget this is a voluntary organization and people choose to participate in setting these standards and then following them. But I believe our strength lies in every leader's choice to put the national movement ahead of their individual states, recognizing that, again, patients go in and out of states. And I'd want to recognize, Jeanette did point out that Hawaii is considering the form, so Hawaii is officially on this list. Thank you for that reminder, Jeanette. So what's included? You can see pages 9 through 24 really go through all these. I'm going to just do a couple of screenshots and to highlight a couple of key things. The first is the name of the document itself. Our old name was POLST, and we defined the acronym as Physician Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment. And this is a problem because, one, it's not just physicians. NPs and PAs can sign, and then two, this doesn't really support the concept that POLST completion is in fact a process that involves other healthcare professionals beyond physicians. And then the second issue is that people thought that life-sustaining treatment was value-laden language. So we're using National POLST Form, a portable medical order. Another reason for that is the term POLST. Many people know that even though they don't know what the acronym stands for. We did look for about a year and a half. At the time, the National POLST Paradigm Task Force looked at a bunch of different name changes, and we also, for those of you on our forum, we had a thread where we were asking state leaders for their opinion. Ultimately, we decided that we had 20 years of building brand equity into the term POLST. Even if people didn't know what it stood for, they did know that it meant this pink form or this portable medical order. And that POLST is actually used in many documents, like the Institute of Medicine Dying in America report, and then the Patient Choice and Quality Care Act. And it wasn't worth our resources to educate people if we changed it to even most, that would just take more effort to get people to understand it was the same thing. So we stuck with POLST, but again, the way that we're defining it, if you see POLST, is a portable medical order. We're not the first organization to no longer use an acronym that was previously an acronym as one. We have more information on the forum if people are interested in the rationale behind that. So looking at the form itself, the patient information section is probably the most robust portion on the form. There was a lot of discussion in the interviews about what was needed and why, especially from developing states who hadn't considered registries to states that have had registries for a while, because the biggest element that we need to think about with this is what information do we need to get that will allow us to match a physical patient electronically to their POLST form. That is the goal, or to make sure that EMS professionals looking at a paper document might have the right information to confirm that this patient is the appropriate person for that POLST. So ultimately, what was chosen here was based on hours of conversation, not only among getting feedback from state leaders in a couple of different ways, but we also had a technology consensus conference in 2018. This conference had over 50 attendees, including from Epic, Cerner, a smattering of health information exchanges, some registries, including the Oregon POLST Registry, different vendors, and ONC. And ONC is the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology. It's a part of the federal HHS, and it's the principal federal entity charged with coordination of nationwide efforts to implement and use the most advanced health information technology and electronic exchange of health information. So essentially, ONC is very interested in making sure this information can be exchanged electronically. All the attendees at this conference ended up having really robust discussions about what is the minimum data set that should be required to promote, and that National POLST should promote, to ensure the matching of patients to POLST forms. And this is actually what you see here is what we will be taking to promote as the national standard going forward. In other words, we're just trying to create a single standard that ONC can help push out to make sure that we don't need a national registry, but instead any state registry or health information exchange can still pass POLST forms using this one standard across state lines and nationally, making sure that POLST is available across the country. I know recently some people saw that Oregon had suggested that address was necessary, but most attendees in several states disagreed with that. The thought was addresses are problematic because patients move around and different healthcare systems and facilities use different addresses. For example, the legal address, where the patient actually lives, where the patient receives mail, all of which may be different. And unless we can have consistency for how and what addresses to put on here, it's not very meaningful. And so the thought was, since we had limited space, not to use it. So that was that, sorry, look at my notes. The next thing that we had at the top of the form was we wanted the top of the form to reiterate who POLST was intended for. And including a reminder about the intended population at the start of the form was critical to our disability consultant. This is an additional way to reinforce and promote our guidance for healthcare professionals that we spent considerable time on last year, talking about the intended population. So we also link to that guide here, and that guide is a one-page document that provides more information. This slide set, I apologize, I realized when I uploaded it, I did not have section A or B on the form, but I want to mention those, even if you can't see them here. For section A, we combined some of the directions into the form. People had directions on the back that we just integrated into that section A. EMS felt it was really important for this to be at the top of the form, even if that's not where you necessarily start the conversation. And additionally, there was broad agreement that if you choose CPR, you should be required to choose full treatment. A number of forms already said that, and many states that were in the process of revising the form were heading that direction. POLST is an out-of-hospital order set, and for the intended population that we're talking about, it really doesn't make sense to allow for anything else medically. So there's strong agreement about that, and so our form really reinforces CPR is full treatment. And then for section B, this pretty much looks similar to any other state's form, other than we have consistency with full treatment being at the top. We also added reminder language at the top of section B that time trials should be considered and that there should be constant evaluation, that just because you picked full treatment, for example, healthcare professionals should still be looking at the patient, evaluating them, and considering if the goals of care are still matched by what the form says. In section C, I think this is kind of a big change that's good for us. We added the language, EMS protocols may limit emergency responder ability to act on orders in this section. And this was added based on EMS's recommendation to set expectations regarding what they can look at and do with a POLST form. So EMS, or first responders, and I'm using that term very broadly. I know that there's a lot of things to dig into with EMS, but speaking broadly, they're looking at CPR choice and whether the patient should be transferred. So it's completely possible that EMS will not even look at this section C at all. And even if they did, protocols would dictate what treatments they can and can't provide. And so we wanted to be clear to everybody that just because something was written in this section didn't mean that EMS was going to be the one that was following it. It may be that the patient still had to be transferred to the hospital, and then the hospital would pay attention to it. And I think that was a big source of confusion among a lot of even healthcare professionals. So adding that, I'm thinking is a positive for being clear with patients as well as about expectations. This section D garnered a lot of debate, starting with whether it should be on the form. And this question was raised prior to 2017 with a couple of states moving the section to the back of their form and listing it as optional. And then it was raised more prominently when Oregon made an announcement in 2018 to remove the section entirely from their form. The plenary assembly members debated this question at their May 2019 meeting, and almost all the plenary assemblies approved keeping it in. And then we also, National POLST ended up publishing a response to Oregon's article published in JAGS. All of this is information that's available online. But the idea was that this is such an important topic. It should be addressed in advanced directives, but most people aren't doing it, but it still needs to be discussed. And POLST can serve as an opportunity to make sure that discussion happens. We did add a box that only a couple of states had, which is the bottom right, saying discussed, but no decision made, indicating that standard of care is provided. We wanted to remind patients, just because you don't fill out a POLST doesn't mean you're not making a decision. You know, understanding what the standard of care is and what you will receive is an important part of deciding whether or not you want a POLST in the first place. So some state forms included trial period language, but varied on their approach. Some linked timeframes to goals of care, and most said that the trial period didn't mean much clinically, or that once a line was in, the trial period was moot. So in the absence of compelling research about that approach, we did not include trial periods as part of this. We used the phrase trial period and just figured that clinically the professionals would do what was appropriate. And then signatures, there's currently some discussion about the supervising signature at the bottom. Physician assistant groups wanted it removed, but currently some states do require this. So at the moment, if you have a state that does not require it, we can have it pre-checked with NA, and then that seems to be a good compromise. Otherwise, we just try to make sure that the language was similar to other state forms about what both patients and healthcare providers are signing off to, saying that they've discussed this order with patients and that it matches the patient's wishes known. And again, the slide set is missing the back side of the form. I apologize about that, but the back side does include information about contact information. It provides, we do remind people that advanced directives should be looked at as part of this process to make sure that they match what POLST forms say. And then we also have our instructions, which again are very similar to most states' forms right now. Some form elements that are excluded, we have these on 25 to 28. It's really impossible to provide an exhaustive list of what was considered and ultimately not included on the POLST form. There was a lot here, different ideas, et cetera, but what I tried to do was gather the things that had the most discussion or seemed to be the biggest talking points. And so the guide goes over each of these, why we didn't include them. The code status checkbox is not something that, for example, exists on any POLST form, but people have kind of theoretically talked about it since it was a point of discussion. A picture of it is included, and then rationale about why we didn't include that. We also have a section on research opportunities. So these were areas where it seems like more discussion is needed for us to really figure out what is the best thing for a POLST form. Some decisions had to be made anyway. So for example, the artificial nutrition and use of gender on the form are two things that we made decisions on. Artificial is on there. We do have gender on the form, but are we presenting it in the right way, and does that really need to be there? This section of the form guide goes through what we currently know and what we need to find out. I think it's kind of fascinating. This is also a short list of what our Research and Quality Assurance Committee is looking at, working on, and anyone that's interested in doing research on POLST, these are areas that we would point them to. And then future steps. Right now, I mentioned earlier that we're working to get support and promotion from national organizations. A number of national organizations weighed in on one or more draft versions of the POLST form and are eager about it. They want to support it. So I'm working with them on whether or not it's a formal acknowledgement, is it a formal recommendation that states adopt, et cetera. It's all over the map, but we're currently working on that. as well as national education, trying to present this at conferences, looking at what articles we might be able to write about it, et cetera. We're trying to increase the number of translations for POLST forms and the patient guides, wanting to make sure that we remember the patient population and make sure that it works for them. And then the Program Standards Committee, which is one of the national governance committees, the expectation is that they will review this every 5 years and update as necessary. But this is, whereas the development of the form was something very much led by the national office, the updates will be done by this committee and always discussed with the plenary assembly at large, especially as we have more states that are adopting it. So again, I would reiterate that we have a vision of nationally patients being able to move in and out of states with ease. So while people may not love the form, hopefully they appreciate the compromise and thought that went into creating it in the first place and can ask, can you live with it? Does this meet your needs to achieve our national collective goal? Or is there a need that you really need to continue using your state form? And again, if you have legislative or regulatory barriers, I'm certainly sympathetic and happy to work with anyone to figure out what steps we can take or how you can use the national form as much as possible. One, if a state adopts the national form but a bordering state does not, will reciprocity work? How? That's a great question. Right now, the reciprocity laws that exist would still control. The good news is that the national form is very, very similar to a lot of the endorsed state forms. So if the state next to you is an endorsed state, chances are you won't have any problems with reciprocity because, again, most states use the substantially similar language if they have a reciprocity statute. If it's a state that has a very different form, it's the same challenges that you would have today with your current POLST form, most likely. If anything, it's an opportunity to educate other states. I know a couple of states that have had challenges are looking at this national form as an opportunity to go to their legislature and say, look, we're not doing it the right way. This is what's been nationally endorsed. Can we adopt this instead of using ours? And hopefully over time we'll eliminate a question like that even having to be asked. And Kevin, if I didn't answer your question fully, please let me know. Jeanette, are we allowed to make any wording changes? Yes, you can make wording changes, but it would not be called the national POLST form. And that may not make a huge difference, but recognizing that we're trying to build more consistency, it's just something for each state to consider. As I mentioned, Alaska did need to make a couple of changes just because legislatively I think it's only physicians who could sign, so they had to remove PAs and NPs from that. So their form isn't called national, it's called the Alaska POLST. I don't know if that's really going to give people a pause or not. So that's something we'll figure out over time, but yes, we can at least talk about wording changes. I will add, Jeanette had asked specifically, we'd like to add allow natural death in Part A. This language was certainly considered because a fair number of states used something along those lines. And ultimately, no one felt strongly enough to keep it on there, but we did want to emphasize that if a patient chose DNR, that essentially if you have a heart attack, your heart stops beating, you're pulseless, et cetera, that you've died. And that's something that we really tried to make clear in the patient guides and helping patients understand the difference between CPR and DNR.